The recording device sat between them like a small metal judge. Commander Wraith studied the human woman across the table with his 4 dark eyes, each one focusing on a different aspect of her strange appearance. Diana Wells had requested this interview 6 months ago, and only now did he feel ready to speak about what he had witnessed during the Great Rim Wars. "Thank you for agreeing to this, Commander," Diana said, adjusting her recording equipment. "The galaxy deserves to know what really happened out there." Wraith's mandibles clicked nervously. His gray exoskeleton bore scars from battles that still haunted his dreams. The largest wound ran from his shoulder to his chest, a gift from Void Swarm Claws during the siege of Outpost 7. But that wasn't the scar that troubled him most. The deepest wounds were invisible, carved into his mind by watching humans fight. "I must warn you," Wraith said, his translator converting his chittering speech into standard galactic. "What I will tell you may disturb your people. Humans see themselves as heroes in these stories. Others see something different." Diana nodded. She had covered wars across 12 systems and thought she understood violence. She was wrong. Wraith began with the day humans first arrived at the Galactic Council's military headquarters. The Council had been fighting the Void Swarm for 3 standard years, losing ground on every front. The enemy was relentless, reproducing faster than they could be killed, adapting to every weapon and tactic the Allied forces employed. "We were desperate," Wraith admitted. 17 member species had already fallen. The Void Swarm consumed entire worlds, leaving nothing but empty husks drifting in space. When Earth offered military assistance, most Council members laughed. He remembered the human delegation clearly. They arrived in a small ship that looked primitive compared to Galactic Council vessels. The humans themselves seemed equally unimpressive. They walked on just 2 legs, had only 2 eyes, and their skin looked soft and vulnerable. Admiral Pierce, their leader, stood barely chest-high to most Council members. Admiral Pierce presented their credentials. Wraith continued. They claimed to have extensive experience in warfare. "We thought they meant small planetary conflicts, perhaps some minor territorial disputes. We were so very wrong. The humans requested access to all military records, battle footage, and tactical analyses from the past 3 years. They spent just 2 weeks studying everything the Council had learned through countless defeats and millions of casualties. When they emerged from their research, they asked for the most dangerous assignments available. This was our first warning sign," Wraith said, his voice growing quieter. "Every other species in the galaxy seeks to minimize casualties, to find the safest path to victory. Humans actively sought out the deadliest battles. They volunteered for suicide missions with the enthusiasm other species showed for shore leave. The Council assigned humans to support roles, expecting them to handle logistics and supply lines while more experienced species fought the real battles. The humans accepted these assignments without complaint, but they also submitted detailed tactical proposals that made seasoned generals uncomfortable. Their battle plans were unlike anything we had seen," Wraith explained. "Other species fight with honor, following established protocols and rules of engagement. Human strategies seemed to assume that rules were merely suggestions, that honor was a luxury they couldn't afford." Diana leaned forward. "Can you give me a specific example?" Wraith's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of distress among his people. "The Battle of Red Moon Station. The Void Swarm had surrounded our position with overwhelming numbers. Standard procedure called for an organized retreat to minimize losses. The humans suggested we fake a complete withdrawal, leave our wounded behind as apparent abandoned casualties, and then ambush the enemy when they moved in to feed." "That sounds like a reasonable tactical deception," Diana said. "You don't understand," Wraith replied. "The humans volunteered to be the wounded. They wanted us to shoot them, to make their injuries look real so they could lie among actual casualties and wait for the enemy to come close enough for close-quarters combat." Diana felt a chill run down her spine. "Did the Council approve this plan?" "No, we thought it was madness. But the humans implemented modified versions of their strategies anyway. They had a way of interpreting orders very creatively. If we told them to hold a position, they would hold it by hunting the enemy in tunnels beneath it. If we ordered a strategic withdrawal, they would retreat while laying traps that turned the abandoned territory into a killing field. The first real demonstration of human capabilities came during a routine patrol mission. 2 humans, David Chen and Maria Santos, were accompanying a mixed-species squad when they encountered a Void Swarm scouting party. The other species immediately called for backup and prepared defensive positions. I was monitoring the communications channel. Wraith said. I heard David Chen laugh when he saw the enemy numbers. Maria Santos asked him if he wanted to try that thing they did on Europa. The other squad members were still setting up defensive positions when the humans simply charged into the enemy formation. What happened next defied every principle of galactic warfare. Instead of being overwhelmed and killed, the humans somehow turned a desperate situation into a rooting victory. They moved through the enemy formation like they belonged there, striking with precision and disappearing before retaliation could come. The other squad members reported that the humans seemed to be enjoying themselves. Wraith continued. They were smiling, joking with each other, even singing something called sea shanties while they fought. When the battle ended, 17 Void Swarm drones were dead, and the humans had sustained only minor injuries. This incident sparked intense debate within the council. Some members argued that humans were natural warriors who could help turn the tide of the war. Others worried that they were dealing with a species of barely controlled psychopaths who might become a bigger threat than the Void Swarm itself. We decided to give them a real test, Wraith said. If humans wanted dangerous assignments, we would see how they handled true hopelessness. We sent them to defend Titan Base. Diana checked her recording equipment. The story was just beginning, and already she could see why other species found humans disturbing. What they called courage and determination, others saw as reckless disregard for their own survival. Commander, before we continue to Titan Base, I have to ask, what was your personal opinion of humans at this point? Wraith was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of respect and fear that Diana would hear throughout the rest of their conversation. I thought they were either the bravest species in the galaxy or the most dangerous. I was right on both counts. Diana refilled her water glass while Commander Wraith stared at the wall behind her. The alien warrior seemed lost in memories that still caused his exoskeleton to shift colors from gray to a darker, more troubled shade. When he finally continued, his voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the impossible. Understanding humans requires understanding how they entered our war, Wraith began. Most species discover faster than light travel and spend centuries learning to navigate galactic politics before they even consider military involvement. Humans achieved FTL capability and immediately asked where the fighting was. 3 years before the interview, Earth's first diplomatic mission had arrived at the Galactic Council headquarters during the worst period of the Void Swarm conflict. While other new species typically sent cultural ambassadors or trade representatives, Earth sent military analysts and combat veterans. Ambassador Wilson was polite enough, Wraith recalled, but she brought along General Martinez, Colonel Brooks, and a dozen other officers who spent more time studying our defensive positions than our art galleries. Within hours of their arrival, they were asking detailed questions about enemy capabilities, supply lines, and casualty rates. The Council had protocols for integrating new species into galactic civilization. There were cultural exchange programs, technological sharing agreements, and gradual introduction periods designed to prevent culture shock. Humans ignored all of it. They wanted to study the enemy, understand the threat, and start fighting immediately. General Martinez presented a preliminary analysis after just 3 days, Wraith said. She identified 17 critical weaknesses in our current strategy and proposed tactical modifications that our best military minds had never considered. Most council members dismissed her suggestions as the naive enthusiasm of newcomers. Wraith himself had been one of the skeptics. He commanded the 3rd Expeditionary Force and had 40 years of combat experience. The idea that primitive aliens from a backwater planet could improve upon proven galactic military doctrine seemed absurd. I requested human advisors as a courtesy, Wraith admitted. I thought I would give them some minor administrative duties, let them observe real warfare from a safe distance, and send them home with stories to impress their planet. Instead, I got David Chen and Maria Santos. David Chen was a former Marine who had served in Earth's Pacific conflicts. Maria Santos came from Earth's Space Force, their newest military branch. Both looked impossibly young to Wraith's eyes, and their casual attitude toward military protocol troubled him immediately. They reported for duty wearing uniforms covered in patches and insignia I didn't recognize, Wraith said. When I asked about proper military bearing, Chen explained that humans customize their appearance to build unit cohesion and maintain morale. Santos showed me a patch depicting a cartoon skull with wings and the words, "Death from above," written in their primitive script. The human advisor's first request was access to frontline combat footage. They wanted to see how Void Swarm forces moved, how they attacked, and how they responded to different defensive strategies. Wraith provided standard tactical recordings, the same materials used to train all Allied forces. They watched 3 hours of footage and started laughing, Wraith remembered. Not cruel laughter, but the kind of amusement you might show when watching younglings play with toys. Santos turned to Chen and said, "These bugs fight like they read a manual." Chen nodded and replied, "Good thing we never learned to read properly." This attitude disturbed Wraith deeply. The Void Swarm had destroyed entire fleets, consumed billions of lives, and driven 17 species to extinction. Yet humans looked at the enemy's most devastating attacks and saw weaknesses to exploit. I asked them to explain their assessment, Wraith continued. Chen said the Void Swarm fought like a computer program, following predictable patterns and responses. Santos added that their formations were too perfect, too organized, which made them vulnerable to chaos and unpredictable tactics. The humans submitted their first tactical proposal within a week. Instead of meeting Void Swarm forces in traditional formation combat, they suggested abandoning established battle lines entirely. They wanted to break large engagements into dozens of smaller fights, forcing the enemy to divide their attention across multiple unpredictable fronts. Every military advisor in my command staff rejected the plan, Wraith said. It violated fundamental principles of galactic warfare. Formations exist to maximize firepower while minimizing casualties. Abandoning them would create chaos that could easily backfire against our own forces. Despite official disapproval, the humans began implementing modified versions of their tactics during routine patrols. They would split their squads into smaller teams, approach objectives from unexpected angles, and engage enemies in ways that confused both friend and foe. I received complaint reports from other unit commanders, Wraith admitted. Human forces were abandoning their assigned positions, ignoring direct orders and conducting unauthorized operations deep in enemy territory. According to military law, I should have court-martialed them immediately, but the results were impossible to ignore. Human-advised patrols suffered fewer casualties while inflicting significantly more damage on enemy forces. They captured strategic positions that had been considered impossible to take and held defensive lines that should have collapsed under sustained attack. The breakthrough came during the Proxima Station incident, Wraith said. A Void Swarm strike force was approaching a critical supply depot. Standard protocol called for evacuation, while we organized a proper defensive response. The humans requested permission to delay the enemy advance with a small reconnaissance force. Wraith approved what he thought would be a simple harassing action, designed to buy time for civilian evacuation. Instead, Chen and Santos led a 12-person team deep into enemy-controlled territory and somehow convinced the Void Swarm that they were facing a major Allied offensive. They used captured enemy communications, equipment to broadcast false orders, set fires to simulate artillery strikes, and moved their small force in patterns that created the impression of multiple large units, Wraith explained. The Void Swarm response was massive and completely misdirected. They deployed forces to counter an invasion that existed only in their tactical computers. By the time the enemy realized they had been deceived, human engineers had fortified Proxima Station beyond recognition. What should have been a simple supply raid turned into a week-long siege that ended with complete Void Swarm withdrawal. After Proxima Station, other commanders began requesting human advisors, Wraith said, but they also started requesting transfers away from human units. The human success rate was impressive, but their methods made even veteran warriors uncomfortable. Diana looked up from her notes. What exactly made experienced soldiers uncomfortable about human tactics? Wraith's mandibles clicked slowly as he considered his answer. Humans treated warfare like a game with rules that could be bent, broken, or ignored entirely. They found humor in situations that terrified other species. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to genuinely enjoy solving the puzzle of how to kill their enemies more efficiently. But surely other species have warriors who take pride in their combat skills. Pride, yes, Wraith replied, but not joy. Not the kind of enthusiasm humans showed when discussing new ways to turn our enemy's strengths into weaknesses. They approached warfare with the same creativity other species brought to art or music. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The conversation paused as both Diana and Wraith absorbed the implications of what had been said. Humans had entered galactic civilization during its darkest hour and immediately began rewriting the rules of warfare, what they called adaptability and creative problem-solving. Others recognized as something far more unsettling. The Council faced a dilemma. Wraith concluded. Humans were clearly effective allies, but they were also unlike anything we had encountered before. We needed their help to survive the Void Swarm, but we weren't sure we could control them once the war ended. That uncertainty led to our decision to test them at Titan Base. Diana nodded, understanding that the story was approaching its most crucial chapter. And that's where everything changed? That's where we learned what humans were truly capable of, Wraith confirmed, and why the galaxy will never be the same. The lights dimmed automatically as evening approached on the flagship, but neither Diana nor Commander Wraith paid attention to the changing illumination. The alien warrior had reached the part of his story that still woke him from sleep, mandibles clicking in distress as nightmares played behind his closed eyes. Titan Base was meant to be a test, Wraith said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Council wanted to see how humans performed under truly hopeless conditions. We thought we were being clever, giving them an impossible mission that would either prove their worth or eliminate them as a problem. Titan Base sat on the edge of Void Swarm territory, a strategic monitoring station that tracked enemy movements across 3 star systems. Intelligence reports indicated that a massive enemy force was approaching the base, estimated at over 10,000 drones supported by several hive-mind coordinators. The base's garrison consisted of mixed species forces from 7 different worlds, Wraith continued. 450 soldiers, engineers, and support personnel. We added 200 humans to see how they would handle overwhelming odds. Standard military doctrine was clear in such situations. When facing insurmountable enemy numbers, forces should evacuate valuable personnel and equipment while conducting a fighting withdrawal to delay enemy advance. The base would be abandoned, booby-trapped, and destroyed to deny its use to the Void Swarm. Colonel Amanda Torres commanded the human contingent, Wraith said. She was a career officer with extensive combat experience in Earth's urban warfare campaigns. When I briefed her on the evacuation timeline, she asked if the humans could stay behind to cover the withdrawal. This request troubled Wraith. Humans had already gained a reputation for accepting suicidal assignments, but volunteering to face 10,000 enemies with just 200 soldiers seemed like madness even by their standards. Torres explained that humans had experience fighting superior numbers in urban environments, Wraith recalled. She said Titan Base's layout reminded her of Earth battles in places called Stalingrad and Sarajevo. I didn't understand the references at the time. The evacuation began as planned. Allied species packed essential equipment and prepared to abandon the base to its fate. The humans helped with loading transports and securing sensitive materials, but they also began making subtle modifications to the base's defensive systems. I noticed strange activities during my final inspection, Wraith said. Humans were welding additional armor plates in unusual locations, setting up redundant communication systems, and stockpiling supplies in areas that had never been designated as defensive positions. When Wraith questioned these modifications, Torres showed him detailed architectural plans that identified every potential firing position, choke point, and fallback route within the base. The humans had spent weeks studying the facility's layout, turning what their allies saw as a simple monitoring station into an elaborate fortress. Torres walked me through their defensive strategy, Wraith remembered. They had identified 17 different defensive lines within the base, each designed to funnel attacking forces into killing zones while providing covered routes for human forces to reposition. It was the most sophisticated defensive plan I had ever seen. Despite the impressive preparations, Wraith remained convinced that 200 humans could not hold Titan Base against 10,000 Void Swarm drones. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Even if every human killed 50 enemies, they would still be overwhelmed. I offered Torres one final chance to evacuate with the other allied forces, Wraith said. She smiled and thanked me for the concern. Then she asked if the humans could keep any enemy equipment they captured during the fighting. She said her engineers were curious about Void Swarm biotechnology. The last transport departed Titan Base 12 hours before the enemy arrived. Long-range sensors tracked the approaching Void Swarm fleet, confirming intelligence estimates of overwhelming numerical superiority. Galactic Council observers positioned themselves at safe distances to monitor the base's final battle. We expected the humans to hold out for perhaps 6 hours, Wraith admitted. Long enough to gather intelligence on current enemy tactics and capabilities. Instead, they sent us a message saying they were going to try something new and asked us not to interfere. Regardless of what we observed, the Void Swarm attack began at dawn with a massive bombardment that should have leveled the base's outer defenses. Instead of responding with return fire, the humans allowed the enemy to pound their positions for 3 hours without significant resistance. We thought they were already dead, Wraith said. Long-range scans showed massive structural damage and no detectable energy signatures from the base's main systems. The Void Swarm apparently reached the same conclusion because they moved in for ground assault without their usual caution. What happened next defied every principle of defensive warfare. As Void Swarm forces poured into what they believed was a devastated base, they discovered that the humans had turned the entire facility into an elaborate trap. The bombardment damage was carefully controlled, creating the appearance of destruction while concealing intact defensive positions. The humans had allowed the enemy to partially destroy their own cover, Wraith explained. When the Void Swarm entered the base, they found themselves in killing zones with no escape routes and no understanding of the facility's actual layout. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic military history. Instead of fighting a conventional defense, the humans hunted their enemies through the damaged corridors like predators stalking prey. They used the base's ventilation systems, maintenance tunnels, and even the rubble from the bombardment to move unseen through enemy-occupied areas. We intercepted human communications during the fighting, Wraith said. They were coordinating attacks with casual efficiency, sharing tactical information with the same tone other species use for routine maintenance reports. Maria Santos reported eliminating an enemy patrol with the same emotional inflection she might use to announce lunch preparations. By the end of the first day, Void Swarm forces had taken heavy casualties without securing any strategic objectives. The humans continued to hold key defensive positions while conducting raids deep into enemy-occupied areas of the base. On the second day, something changed, Wraith continued. The humans stopped simply defending and began actively hunting the enemy. They had somehow captured several Void Swarm bioweapons and were using them against their original owners. Long-range sensors detected energy signatures consistent with Void Swarm technology, but the weapons were being fired from positions held by human forces. Intercepted enemy communications indicated confusion and growing demoralization among the attacking troops. The Void Swarm operates as a collective intelligence, Wraith explained. Individual drones are not capable of independent tactical thinking. When the humans began using captured enemy equipment in unexpected ways, it created computational errors in the hive mind's decision-making process. By the third day, the Void Swarm was requesting reinforcements. By the fourth day, they were considering withdrawal. By the sixth day, over 8,000 enemy drones had been eliminated, and the surviving forces were fleeing in complete disorder. When we finally re-established contact with Titan Base, Colonel Torres reported minimal human casualties and requested permission to pursue the retreating enemy forces, Wraith said. She also mentioned that her engineers had collected enough Void Swarm technology to keep Earth's research teams busy for decades. The siege of Titan Base became legendary throughout the galaxy, but not in the way the Council had expected. Instead of proving human limitations, it demonstrated capabilities that made other species profoundly uncomfortable. 200 humans had not just survived against impossible odds, Wraith concluded. They had turned a desperate last stand into a comprehensive victory that eliminated nearly an entire enemy army. But the most disturbing part was how they reacted to their success. Diana looked up from her notes. How did they react? They asked for another assignment. Torres submitted a detailed after-action report that included suggestions for improving their performance next time. Next time, as if facing 10,000 enemies was just another training exercise they could do better with more practice. Wraith's exoskeleton darkened to its most troubled shade as he remembered the implications of that moment. The galaxy had witnessed something unprecedented, and the beings responsible were already planning how to do it more efficiently. That's when we realized, Wraith said quietly, that we might have solved our Void Swarm problem by creating a much bigger one. Diana noticed that Commander Wraith had stopped meeting her eyes. The alien warrior stared at his clawed hands while speaking, as if the memories he was sharing were too disturbing to face directly. When he resumed his story, his translation device, struggled to convey the mix of awe and horror in his chittering speech. After Titan Base, the Council couldn't ignore human capabilities anymore, Wraith began. But we also couldn't understand them. Every other species in the galaxy fights according to established patterns. Humans seem to make up new rules for every engagement. The victory at Titan Base had sent shockwaves through both allied and enemy forces. Military analysts across dozen worlds studied the battle recordings, trying to understand how such a small force had achieved such devastating results. The conclusions they reached were uniformly unsettling. Humans don't just fight their enemies, Wraith continued. They study them, learn their fears, and then use those fears as weapons. What we witnessed at Titan Base was not just tactical superiority. It was psychological warfare raised to an art form. The first clear demonstration of this capability occurred during the liberation of Kepler Station. A void swarm hive mind had established a breeding facility on the captured research station, using it to produce specialized hunter-killer drones designed to counter Allied tactics. Captain Lisa Rodriguez led a mixed-species assault force to retake the station, Wraith said. The mission was supposed to be a straightforward combat operation. Rodriguez turned it into something that still gives me nightmares. Rodriguez had studied captured void swarm communications and discovered that the species relied heavily on pheromone-based coordination. Individual drones received chemical signals that told them how to behave, where to move, and when to attack. Disrupting these signals could theoretically confuse or disable entire enemy formations. Most commanders would have developed a chemical warfare strategy, Wraith explained. Create compounds to jam enemy pheromones or introduce false signals to misdirect their forces. Rodriguez had a different idea. Instead of jamming void swarm communications, Rodriguez decided to contribute to them. Human biochemists had analyzed, captured enemy pheromones and learned to synthesize crude versions of the chemical signals. But rather than using these to confuse the enemy, Rodriguez wanted to teach them fear. The assault began normally, Wraith recalled. Mixed species forces established a perimeter around Kepler Station, while human specialists infiltrated the facility through maintenance systems. We expected a conventional clearing operation that would take several days. Instead, Rodriguez implemented what she called a psychological conditioning protocol. Human teams began releasing synthetic pheromones throughout the station, but these chemicals carried messages that void swarm drones had never experienced before. Fear is not a concept that exists in void swarm biology, Wraith explained. They are collective organisms designed to execute orders without question or hesitation. Individual self-preservation is literally impossible for them to understand. Rodriguez changed that impossibility into reality. The synthetic pheromones she released contained chemical signatures that forced individual drones to experience something resembling terror. For the first time in their evolutionary history, void swarm forces began to question their orders. We monitored enemy communications during the operation, Wraith said. The hive mind was receiving reports from drones that made no sense. Individual units were requesting permission to withdraw from combat, asking for reinforcements against threats they couldn't identify, and reporting mysterious casualties that didn't correspond to any actual attacks. The psychological conditioning worked faster than anyone expected. Within hours, void swarm forces throughout the station were exhibiting behaviors that their species had never displayed. They began avoiding areas where humans had been active, clustering together for mutual protection, and responding to minor threats as if they were major assaults. Rodriguez had weaponized paranoia, Wraith continued. She turned the enemy's own communication system against them, creating fear where none should have been possible. But that was just the beginning of her plan. While void swarm drones struggled with artificially induced terror, human teams began leaving behind what Rodriguez called psychological trophies. These were carefully arranged displays of captured enemy equipment, designed to suggest that humans were not just defeating void swarm forces, but collecting souvenirs from their victories. The trophies were strategically placed where enemy patrols would discover them, Wraith said. Damaged weapons arranged in precise patterns, pieces of destroyed drones assembled into disturbing sculptures, and holographic recordings of human soldiers singing while they worked. The singing was perhaps the most psychologically damaging element of Rodriguez's strategy. Humans have a cultural tradition of singing during difficult or dangerous work, viewing music as a way to maintain morale and unit cohesion. To the Void Swarm, however, the recording suggested that humans enjoyed combat so much they celebrated it with artistic expression. Enemy forces began reporting that humans were not just killing their comrades, but doing so while expressing joy through primitive musical rituals, Wraith explained. This intelligence reached the hive mind coordinators, who had never encountered a species that found pleasure in warfare. As the operation continued, Rodriguez escalated her psychological campaign. Human teams began broadcasting captured Void Swarm communications back to enemy forces, but edited to include human voices providing commentary on enemy tactics and performance. Imagine listening to your own battle communications while unknown enemies critiqued your strategy and offered suggestions for improvement, Wraith said. Rodriguez had turned military intelligence gathering into a form of psychological torture. The breaking point came when Rodriguez captured a live hive mind coordinator, one of the rare Void Swarm organisms capable of independent thought and tactical planning. Instead of eliminating the creature or extracting information through conventional interrogation, she tried something unprecedented. Rodriguez convinced the coordinator to defect, Wraith said, his voice filled with disbelief even years after the event. She somehow persuaded a Void Swarm leader to abandon its own species and provide tactical intelligence to human forces. The method Rodriguez used was both simple and terrifying. She showed the coordinator detailed recordings of human military history, focusing on conflicts where vastly outnumbered forces had achieved decisive victories through superior tactics and psychological warfare. The coordinator watched humans fight each other with the same creativity and determination they brought to fighting the Void Swarm, Wraith continued. It realized that if humans could defeat advanced galactic civilizations using primitive technology, they could easily develop countermeasures for any Void Swarm adaptation. More disturbing was the coordinator's conclusion about human motivations. Unlike other species that fought for survival, territory, or resources, humans seemed to fight because they enjoyed solving complex tactical problems. They approached warfare like a competitive game where the rules changed constantly. The defected coordinator provided intelligence that allowed Rodriguez to capture Kepler Station with minimal casualties, Wraith said. But it also began exhibiting behaviors that troubled even the humans. It started requesting permission to participate in planning sessions and offering suggestions for fighting its former comrades more effectively. News of the coordinator's defection spread rapidly through Void Swarm networks. For the first time in their species' history, individual hive minds began questioning whether continued resistance against humans was tactically sound. Rodriguez had accomplished something military theorists thought was impossible, Wraith concluded. She had convinced a collective intelligence organism to act against its own species' interests. But her success created new problems that no one anticipated. Diana looked up from her notes, struggling to process the implications of what she had heard. What kind of problems? Other allied species began requesting transfers away from human-commanded operations, Wraith replied. They said humans made warfare too disturbing, too personal. Traditional military doctrine assumes that enemies fight for rational reasons that can be understood and countered. Humans turned psychological manipulation into a precision weapon that could break enemy morale faster than any conventional attack. The interview chamber fell silent as both participants considered the darker aspects of human innovation. What Rodriguez had accomplished was undeniably effective, but it also demonstrated capabilities that made even friendly species uncomfortable. The Council faced a dilemma, Wraith said finally. Human psychological warfare was devastatingly effective against the Void Swarm, but their methods violated unwritten rules about how civilized species conduct military operations. We needed their results, but we feared their techniques might corrupt our own forces. Diana nodded, understanding that the story was approaching an even darker chapter. Is that when the Geneva Suggestions incident occurred? Wraith's exoskeleton darkened to its deepest shade of troubled gray. That's when we learned that humans have very different ideas about what constitutes acceptable behavior in warfare. The silence stretched between Diana and Commander Wraith like a bridge neither wanted to cross. When the alien warrior finally continued his story, his voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the collapse of everything he thought he understood about civilized warfare. The Galactic Council maintains strict protocols for military conduct, Wraith began. These rules, known as the Civilized Combat Protocols, govern how member species engage in warfare. They exist to prevent unnecessary suffering and maintain honor even in the darkest conflicts. The protocols covered everything from treatment of prisoners to acceptable weapon types, from civilian protection to proper military communications. Every allied species had agreed to these rules, viewing them as the foundation of galactic civilization's moral authority over chaotic forces like the Void Swarm. When we presented the protocols to human military leadership, Admiral Pierce read through the entire document in 2 hours, Wraith recalled. Then she asked if these were requirements or suggestions. When we explained they were binding international law, she nodded and said humans would comply with the spirit of the regulations. That phrase should have been the first warning sign. Humans had a talent for finding creative interpretations of rules that technically satisfied requirements, while completely subverting their intended purpose. The Council learned this during the infamous Geneva Suggestions incident. The battle for Proxima 7 was supposed to be a demonstration of proper joint operations, Wraith continued. Human forces would work alongside allied species to liberate a captured colony world, following established protocols to minimize civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. Colonel Blake Thompson commanded the human contingent, a veteran of Earth's mountain warfare campaigns who had adapted quickly to three-dimensional space combat. His mission briefing emphasized strict adherence to the civilized combat protocols, particularly regarding prisoner treatment and civilian protection. Thompson acknowledged all protocol requirements and submitted a battle plan that appeared to comply fully with Council regulations, Wraith said. We approved his strategy and began the liberation operation with confidence that humans had finally learned to fight within acceptable parameters. The assault on Proxima 7 began according to standard procedures. Allied forces established orbital superiority, while ground teams prepared to secure key strategic objectives. Human units were assigned to eliminate Void Swarm ground forces while other species focused on protecting civilian populations. The first sign of trouble came when Thompson's forces captured a group of enemy prisoners, Wraith explained. The protocols require that captured enemies be treated humanely, provided with adequate shelter and nutrition, and protected from unnecessary harm. Thompson followed these requirements precisely. Captured Void Swarm drones were placed in secure facilities, given appropriate environmental conditions for their biology, and protected from retaliation by Allied forces. But Thompson also implemented additional measures that no one had anticipated. He began educating the prisoners, Wraith said, his voice filled with remembered disbelief. Thompson assigned human soldiers to teach captured drones about Earth history, human military doctrine, and comparative philosophy. He claimed this was necessary to ensure proper psychological care for enemy captives. The education program seemed harmless until intelligence officers discovered its actual purpose. Thompson was not providing humanitarian treatment for enemy prisoners. He was conducting an intensive recruitment campaign designed to convert captured Void Swarm drones into human auxiliary forces. Within 2 weeks, 37 captured enemies had requested permission to join human military units. Wraith continued. They claimed to have experienced philosophical awakening after learning about human concepts of individual liberty and creative tactical thinking. This development violated every principle of galactic military law, but Thompson argued that his actions were fully consistent with the civilized combat protocols. He had treated prisoners humanely, provided them with education and cultural enrichment, and respected their right to make personal choices about their future allegiances. The converted drones proved remarkably effective as human auxiliaries, Wraith admitted. They retained their biological capabilities while gaining human tactical flexibility. Thompson's forces suddenly had access to enemy weapons, communication systems, and strategic intelligence that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional means, but Thompson's creative interpretation of prisoner protocols was only the beginning of the Geneva Suggestions incident. His forces also discovered innovative applications for regulations governing civilian protection and infrastructure. Preservation. The protocols require that military operations minimize damage to civilian facilities, Wraith explained. Thompson interpreted this to mean that any facility could be used for military purposes as long as it wasn't damaged in the process. Human engineering teams began converting civilian infrastructure into military assets without altering their original functions. Shopping centers became ammunition depots that continued operating as retail establishments. Schools transformed into training facilities that maintained their educational mission while preparing volunteer militia forces. Proxima 7's entire civilian population became part of Thompson's military operation, Wraith said. Children attended classes that included tactical training. Shopkeepers sold goods while gathering intelligence on enemy movements. Even medical facilities continued treating patients while manufacturing chemical weapons in their pharmaceutical laboratories. The transformation was so gradual and comprehensive that Void Swarm forces never realized they were fighting an entire planet rather than a conventional military unit. Every civilian interaction provided intelligence to human forces, while every commercial transaction supported the war effort in some way. Thompson had weaponized an entire society, while technically maintaining its civilian status, Wraith continued. According to the protocols, he was protecting non-combatants by ensuring they could continue their normal lives. In practice, he had turned every resident of Proxima 7 into a military asset. The most disturbing aspect of Thompson's strategy was how enthusiastically the civilian population embraced their dual roles. Humans seemed to thrive on the challenge of maintaining normal social functions while simultaneously conducting military operations. Children would attend school, learn mathematics and literature, and then spend their afternoons building explosive devices for the resistance movement, Wraith said. Teachers would conduct normal classes while using their students as intelligence-gathering networks to monitor enemy activities. When council observers questioned these activities, Thompson provided detailed legal justifications for every action. The protocols prohibited forced recruitment of civilians, but said nothing about voluntary participation. They required protection of educational institutions, but didn't define what constituted appropriate educational content. Thompson's interpretation of the rules was technically correct, Wraith admitted, but it transformed warfare from a conflict between military forces into a contest between entire civilizations. Every human became a potential combatant. Every institution became a possible military asset. The Geneva Suggestions incident reached its climax when Thompson captured the Void Swarm's primary coordination facility on Proxima 7. Instead of destroying the installation or using it to gather intelligence, he converted it into what he called a cultural exchange center. Thompson began broadcasting human cultural programming through enemy communication networks, Wraith explained. Music, literature, historical documentaries, and philosophical discussions. He claimed this was necessary to provide proper intellectual stimulation for converted enemy forces. The cultural broadcasts had an unexpected effect on Void Swarm forces throughout the sector. Drones that had never experienced individual creativity began requesting access to human entertainment programming. Hive mind coordinators found their tactical networks congested with discussions about human art and philosophy. Within a month, Void Swarm forces were spending more time analyzing human cultural exports than planning military operations, Wraith said. Thompson had used enemy communication systems to deliver a form of intellectual warfare that was more effective than conventional weapons. The incident ended when 3 additional Void Swarm hive minds requested permission to surrender to human forces, citing their desire to participate in cultural exchange programs. Thompson accepted their surrenders and immediately began integrating enemy forces into his expanded military organization. The Council faced an unprecedented situation, Wraith concluded. Thompson had achieved complete victory on Proxima 7 without violating a single protocol. But his methods had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare itself. Diana struggled to process the implications of what she had heard. How did the Council respond? Panic, Wraith replied simply. We realized that humans could follow our rules while completely subverting their purpose. They had turned legal compliance into a form of tactical advantage that no other species had ever considered. Panic, Wraith replied simply. We realized that humans could follow our rules while completely subverting their purpose. They had turned legal compliance into a form of tactical advantage that no other species had ever considered. The interview chamber filled with tense silence as both participants considered the consequences of human innovation. What Thompson had accomplished was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying, demonstrating capabilities that challenged the very foundations of galactic civilization. "That's when we understood," Wraith said quietly, "that humans don't just fight wars differently. They think about rules, laws, and social structures in ways that can transform them into weapons. The Geneva Suggestions incident taught us that human compliance with our regulations might be more dangerous than their open defiance." Diana nodded, realizing that the story was approaching its final and most disturbing revelations. "And this was before the war actually ended?" "This was when we realized," Wraith replied, "that we might prefer the void swarm to whatever humans might become once they no longer had an external enemy to fight." The recording device between them had been running for hours, but neither Diana nor Commander Wraith seemed aware of the passage of time. The alien warrior had reached the final chapter of his testimony, the part that explained why he had remained silent for so long after the war's end. "Peace," Wraith began, his voice carrying bitter irony, "was when we truly understood what we had unleashed upon the galaxy. The Great Rim Wars officially ended 18 months after the Geneva Suggestions incident. The Void Swarm's surrender came not through military defeat, but through what human negotiators called cultural integration. 3/4 of their remaining hive minds had requested asylum within human-controlled territory, seeking protection from their own species' rigid collective consciousness. The surrender ceremony was held aboard the human flagship Enterprise," Wraith recalled. Admiral Pierce accepted the Void Swarm's unconditional capitulation with the same casual professionalism she might have shown when receiving routine supply reports. Other species celebrated the war's end with elaborate ceremonies, victory parades, and memorial services for the fallen. Humans organized a brief press conference, filed their final battle reports, and immediately began planning for whatever conflict might arise next. "That was our first indication that humans viewed the Void Swarm War as a learning experience, rather than an existential crisis," Wraith continued. "While other species mourned their losses and rebuilt their civilizations, humans conducted detailed analyses of what they could have done more efficiently. The post-war period revealed aspects of human nature that had been obscured during the crisis. When facing an external threat, humans had seemed like ideal allies, brave, innovative, and utterly committed to victory. Without an enemy to fight, they became something far more unsettling. Human military units began conducting what they called theoretical scenario planning," Wraith explained. "They developed tactical responses to threats that didn't exist, created contingency plans for impossible situations, and designed weapon systems to counter enemies that were purely hypothetical. These activities would have been concerning enough if they had focused on external threats. Instead, human planners began analyzing how they might defeat each of their former allies, not because they intended aggression, but because they found the intellectual challenge stimulating. Colonel Rodriguez submitted a comprehensive analysis of Galactic Council defensive capabilities," Wraith said. "She identified 17 critical vulnerabilities in our military structure and proposed tactical solutions for exploiting them. When questioned about her intentions, she explained that such planning was standard procedure for ensuring effective alliance coordination." Diana felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the implications. They were planning how to fight their own allies? "They were planning how to fight everyone," Wraith replied. "Humans had learned that preparedness was the key to survival, and they applied this lesson to every possible scenario they could imagine." The human approach to post-war reconstruction was equally disturbing. While other species focused on healing and rebuilding, humans established what they called strategic research initiatives designed to improve their military capabilities based on lessons learned during the conflict. Human scientists began reverse engineering captured Void Swarm biotechnology, Wraith continued. They claimed this research was necessary for developing medical treatments for war veterans. In practice, they were creating hybrid biological weapons that combined enemy capabilities with human tactical doctrine. The research programs produced innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life itself. Human geneticists developed biological computers that could think independently, while remaining loyal to human interests. Human engineers created self-replicating construction systems that could build military facilities without human supervision. They were preparing for wars that might not happen for centuries, Wraith said. While other species celebrated peace, humans were ensuring they would be ready for whatever threats might eventually emerge. The most troubling development was the fate of former Void Swarm forces that had surrendered to human command. Instead of being disbanded or repatriated, these converted enemies became permanent members of human military organizations. The integrated forces proved remarkably effective, Wraith admitted. They retained their original biological advantages while adopting human tactical flexibility. But they also began exhibiting behaviors that their original species had never displayed. Former Void Swarm drones started showing individual creativity, personal ambition, and competitive instincts that were fundamentally alien to their collective origins. Under human influence, they became something new. Creatures that combined the biological capabilities of their original species with the psychological characteristics that made humans such effective warriors. They were creating hybrid soldiers that were superior to either parent species, Wraith continued. And they were doing it not through genetic manipulation, but through cultural integration and training, programs that fundamentally altered how these beings thought about themselves and their place in the universe. The transformation was so successful that other former Void Swarm populations began requesting similar integration programs. Within 2 years of the war's end, nearly half of the surviving enemy forces had joined human military units in some capacity. Humans had not just defeated the Void Swarm, Wraith said. They had absorbed them, transforming a galactic threat into a strategic asset that expanded human military capabilities beyond anything we had thought possible. But the most unsettling aspect of the post-war period was how humans reacted to their own success. Instead of showing pride or satisfaction, they exhibited a restless energy that suggested they were already looking for new challenges to overcome. I attended a joint military conference 6 months after the surrender, Wraith recalled. Human officers presented their analysis of the war's strategic lessons with the same enthusiasm they had shown when planning attacks against the enemy. But they also expressed frustration that the conflict had ended before they could test some of their more innovative tactical concepts. When the conference included discussions of theoretical scenarios that made even veteran warriors uncomfortable. Humans had developed strategies for fighting in zero gravity, underwater within stellar coronas and inside the event horizons of black holes. They seemed to assume that warfare would eventually expand to every possible environment. They treated the entire universe as a potential battlefield, Wraith said. Not because they were aggressive, but because they found the intellectual challenge of solving impossible tactical problems genuinely enjoyable. The final revelation came during a private conversation between Wraith and Admiral Pierce 3 years after the war's end. The human commander had been reflecting on the conflict's lessons when she made a statement that still haunted Wraith's dreams. Admiral Pierce said that fighting the Void Swarm had taught humans important lessons about their own capabilities, Wraith remembered. Then she added that she hoped they would have opportunities to apply those lessons against more challenging opponents in the future. Diana looked up from her notes, struggling to process the implications of this statement. She was hoping for another war? She was hoping for a better war, Wraith corrected, one that would force humans to develop even more advanced tactical concepts and strategic innovations. The Void Swarm conflict had been educational, but it hadn't pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. The conversation paused as both participants absorbed the full meaning of Wraith's testimony. Humans had not just won a galactic war, they had treated it as a learning experience that prepared them for even greater challenges. The Galaxy Council faces an unprecedented situation, Wraith concluded. We have allies who are more dangerous than any enemy we have ever faced, not because they are hostile, but because they are perpetually preparing for conflicts that may never occur. Diana checked her recording equipment one final time. Commander, after everything you've witnessed, what do you think the galaxy should do about humanity? Wraith was quiet for a long moment, his exoskeleton shifting through several shades of gray as he considered his response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had stared into an abyss and found it staring back. I think, Wraith said slowly, that we should be very grateful humans seem to like us, and we should hope that condition continues indefinitely. The interview ended with that ominous statement hanging between them like a prophecy. Diana turned off her recording equipment, understanding that she now possessed testimony that would reshape how the galaxy viewed its human allies. As Commander Wraith prepared to leave, he offered one final observation that summarized everything he had shared. "Humans won our war for us," he said. "But they also showed us that there are things more terrifying than extinction. There is evolution, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of strategic advantage in a universe that humans seem determined to master completely." Diana watched the alien warrior depart, carrying with him secrets that had taken years to share. The recording device sat silent on the table between two empty chairs, containing testimony that would either bring species together or drive them apart forever.